Hello.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are
Welcome.
ready for lesson 2.8, which is called
2.8.
Solving Rational Equations. Mr. Lecky, why are we doing lesson 2.8 now?
Because why not? No, I'm kidding. 2.8. Rational functions are equations are solving equations with a bunch of fractions in it. We've
Oh.
done that with numbers.
We have.
We've done all this factoring. We spent all this time learning how to do this. Quadratics. All we're going to do is take all those skills and combine them into one lesson.
So we're still solving.
So it just makes sense to keep solving problems because we're just going to solve everything now.
Okay, so refresh our memory. When we're solving equations involving fractions, what do we need to do?
We need to get rid of the fractions by multiplying the entire equation or every term in the equation by the least common denominator.
Very good. So the only difference now is that our least common denominator is not necessarily numbers.
You know, it's always going to have letters. Well, not always, but the
It's got
majority of times.
algebraic expressions in it.
Yes,
So
lots of letters.
we're going to take a couple minutes and walk you through that process just to make sure, because this is really key to being able to solve
Should I
this.
refresh the memory on that
You should.
15 and 25 number we did
You
last
should.
time? All right, let me show you something real quick. A couple of lessons back, we had this denominator of 15 and a denominator of 25, and we figured out that the least common denominator was 75. And we did it by factoring 15 down to 3 times 5 and factoring 25 to 5 times 5. And all we do to find the least common denominator was take the first two terms, or take everything from the first fraction, 3 and 5,
times 5.
and then just take the new stuff from the second fraction.
Okay,
We already had a 5.
so cross that off.
But we didn't have a second 5, so we needed a second 5. So our least common denominator was 3 times 5 times 5.
Which is 75.
Okay?
We're
Now,
going to do the same thing now, but we're going to do it with letters.
all letters.
Okay.
So we have a 3t. That doesn't really do anything, so it's just 3 times t.
Okay.
We have a 5t squared, which is 5 and 2 t's multiplied together.
Okay.
So we
in
take
our LCD,
everything from the first term,
3 times t.
3 times t. Then we take the new stuff from the second one.
Okay, well,
or the
5
third
is
one.
new.
5 is new, so we multiply by 5.
We already have a t,
Already have 1 t.
but we don't have a second t.
Need another t.
So it would be 15t squared?
So 15t squared would be the least common denominator for the
Okay.
first two fractions.
All right.
How does the second one work? Well, we have 3h squared, which is just 3hh.
All right.
Then we have hhh for h cubed. Take everything from the first one,
3hh.
and only the new stuff. Well, we have 1h already. We actually have a second h too.
We don't have the third
We don't have a third one, so we need a third one. So that's going to make 3h cubed as our least common denominator.
one. Okay.
All right, now, get a little trickier here because we have a plus sign. We have a plus sign, we think about factoring in the sense that we did in our other lessons,
Okay.
not just with breaking apart the multiplying of 3t and 5t squared.
And you cannot break up the plus sign
No,
at
leave
all.
the plus signs.
So leave that there.
In fact, z plus 1 does not factor.
It's just z plus 1.
So it is a factor. The only thing that's going to be like z plus 1 is,
Z plus 1.
that's it, or 1 plus z. All right, so 2z squared plus 2z can factor using a what?
Greatest common factor.
And
2z.
what would that be? 2z. Take a 2z out, and we end up with a
Z plus 1.
plus 1 instead of all of that.
Okay.
So now our least common denominator is going to be found by taking all of the first one.
Okay.
So we have 2z times z plus 1, and whatever's new for the second fraction.
But z plus 1's not new. It's already there.
It's already there. So that is our least common denominator.
And notice how Mr. Lecky left that in factored form, whereas the other ones could be multiplied together or however's easy for you. But whenever you start to see plusing and minusing, you definitely want to leave
Yeah,
it
just
in
leave it.
factored form.
It'll be a lot easier to cancel them.
Absolutely. And letter D is a little bit different.
Letter D is actually easier.
Easier.
We have y plus 2,
Okay.
but that doesn't factor.
So we need the whole y plus 2.
Whole y minus 1, does that factor?
No.
No, so the whole factor is y minus 1.
Okay.
So our least common denominator is everything from the first one,
Y plus 2.
and then anything that's new from the second one. Well,
Y minus 1.
y minus 1 is new.
So you mean to tell me that the y's can't cancel?
No, there's nothing in common between y plus 2 and y minus 1.
Okay. The plus and minus, you can never, ever, 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 ever cancel when there's a
Ever?
plus and a minus. Ever.
How many evers was that?
As many as we need.
Okay,
Until they get it.
let's try some problems then, shall we?
Okay.
You want to do these, or you
Sure,
want me to
the
do
first
these?
one's super easy
All right.
because we already did it. We did it a couple of lessons ago. But if we want to get rid of these fractions, we've got a 3 in the first denominator, a 5 in the second one. If you want to be technical, there's a 1 right there. And we're going to multiply all 3 pieces by the
Which
least
would
common denominator of.
15, which is just 3
15.
times 5.
Okay. So on the first one, 3 would go into 15
Five
5
times?
times. We had a 5a. And the 5 would go into 15.
3 times.
And we have a 3 times the other a. And on the right side of the equation then, we got a 4 times 15, which
60.
is 60. So we get 8a equals 60.
Divide by 8, and 60 over 8 will reduce by 4 to be 15 halves.
And that's it. We're done. So this is review. Notice it's the same process. Now we're going to take that process and turn it into some more algebra and doing rational equations. So variables, okay? So let's talk LCD this time, okay? First denominator is 4 times x. If you want, you could write 2 times 2. So we got 4 times x. Next denominator is a 3. So
we don't have a 3,
We don't
so
have
we
a
need
3.
a 3.
So we need a 3. And the last one is an x.
Well, we already have an x, so
We
we
already
don't
have
need
an x.
anything new.
Okay, so let's use an LCD of 12x. So what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the entire equation. You can write that like this if you want to, or if it's easier to cancel, you can write times 12x, times, squish it in there, rewrite it, whatever you need to do, times by 12x. But all of those pieces get multiplied by 12x.
Every term.
Okay, so if we look at the first set here, 4x and 12x, the x's will cancel.
And remember, everything in the denominators has to cancel. So if you don't, then you did something wrong somewhere along the line. So
Absolutely.
in this case, the x's cancel, and the 4 goes into 12 how many times?
3 times, and I have a 5 left over. So you can write 3 times 5, or you could just write 15. I'm doing this for a purpose. You'll see that in a minute. All right, so the next one, second set in the middle,
Well,
the 3 goes into 12.
4 times.
So I have a plus in the middle,
You know, 4, but we didn't cancel the x, and then we have the times 2 from the top.
okay?
And now we have our equal sign. On the other
Equals.
side, the x is going to cancel, and we get 1 times 12, which is just 12.
That one I can do in my head. All right, so then this is going to give us 15
From here,
plus
it's algebra 1.
8x.
Clean it up, get your answer. And there's one little thing we need to talk about.
Okay, go ahead, keep talking.
I'll keep talking while she's writing. We need to make sure when we're done that we don't get an answer that kind of violates the rules of math. And the rule of math that we're most concerned with in these problems is we cannot get an x value that makes the denominator of any fraction in the problem 0. Because then we've divided by 0, and that's not allowed.
Bad
okay?
things happen.
Bad things happen, really bad things, okay? So in this case, the only x that would have given us a 0 in the denominator is what?
0, because 4
0.
times 0 is 0, or x equals 0 is 0.
So before you're finished, be sure that you didn't get an answer that gives you a 0 in the original problem in the denominator of the problem. And negative 3/8 is not 0, so we're okay in this
We
problem.
are good.
Okay? Now to continue that line of thought, let's look at example 4a. What x value would give you 0 in the first fraction?
Negative 1.
Negative 1. So what we're going to do is just off to the side, if you need to, write yourself a note that x cannot equal negative 1. And what about the second fraction?
Positive 3.
Positive 3. So if you get either one of these answers, you have to throw them out. They're not any good. If you happen to get both of those answers, then either
you
one of
won't-
them are good.
You don't have any solutions. We call these extraneous solutions. They're simply solutions that don't work.
Even though all the algebra was right,
Yep.
in the end, they didn't work at all. So how are we going to do this? What are we going to do first?
Well, we've got 3 pieces here, and we need to multiply by a least common denominator. And a minute ago, you told me that x plus 1 is its own factor, and x minus 3 is its own factor. And so I think the LCD should be x plus 1 times x minus 3.
Perfect.
And again, you can write this by all 3 pieces if you would like. It's up to you.
Takes up a
Okay.
lot more space. Some of you will actually find it easier to not mess up with, but
Yep. So in the first chunk, the x plus 1 will cancel, and we're going to have the x left over from the top times the x minus 3 left over from the LCD.
okay.
Okay, we got
And we'll
plus
use it
in the
again.
middle. And the second chunk, the x minus 3 will cancel, and we'll have the 3 times the x plus 1. On the right side is where people make the most mistakes.
Yes, whenever there's a number, there's 3 things.
Well, most people forget, first of all, to even multiply that at all. They just put negative 1. So if you're finding yourself making
Don't do
mistakes,
that.
watch out for that. And a nice thing to do when you're double checking this problem with a friend is first check for, did you have the same LCD? And second check, what did you have after you multiplied by that LCD and your fractions went away? That's a good place to check. Another good place to check is the next thing that we're trying to get to, which is go ahead and distribute. And right away we notice we've got x squared.
Now, how would you suggest multiplying this? That's what I like to do.
In my head.
X plus 1 times x minus 3. I would go ahead, if I were you, and go ahead and distribute that all, FOIL, whatever your word is, but multiply
Use a
those two
box.
together first.
Absolutely.
Multiplication is associative and commutative, so you can do it any order you want.
Yep.
So go ahead and multiply x plus 1 times x minus 3 first, and then distribute the negative 1 to the entire process, okay? And if you need to do it in more than steps than Mrs. Cofield did, then that's
Go for it.
wonderful.
Go for it.
Do as many steps as you need to get it right.
Okay, now at this point, we're recognizing that we've got x squareds
Everywhere.
and x's. And hopefully you remember from a couple classes ago when we were solving with x squared and x that we're going to either need to factor, do the quadratic formula, something like that.
We can even complete the square, but
We could if we really wanted to.
most people
but-
don't choose to do that.
For factoring or quadratic formula, we need it to all equal 0. I personally don't ever like for the first term coefficient to be negative, so I would add this x squared over here and get 2x squared. which means I'm going to put everything on my left side. Okay, and this is a good place, and the 3's will cancel. That's convenient. This is another good place to check your problem with a friend. Okay, so rather than toiling through all the algebra, just check for where you guys both got it.
Unless you're taking a test or a quiz, then bad.
That's bad to check with a friend. So now we can factor, or we could do quadratic formula.
Let's do
Mr.
factoring
Lucky?
because we only have two terms, and I see a
Absolutely.
common factor of 2x in both of them, and using any other method would just be silly.
It would.
Lots of work.
We also talked about a couple classes ago, that you're using the zero product property. Okay.
So either 2x is 0,
Yep. Which
which
is going
means
to give
x
you.
is 0, or x minus 1 is 0, which means x is 1,
Okay.
and we have our two answers. Now, before we move on, what do we have to make sure that we double check for both of these answers?
We were not allowed to equal -1. We were not allowed to equal 3.
And did we ever come up with either one of those
We
answers?
did not.
So we're
those
good.
Are both good answers.
We're okay.
Okay.
All right.
All right. You want to try letter B?
I'll do letter B.
Okay. I'll erase some of my stuff here. I hope you copied that down.
Press rewind if you didn't.
He needs more room.
Yeah.
Well, probably not, because he writes
I
about
take
that
up a lot of
big.
space. Okay, here we have two fractions equal to each other. And some of you might be just looking at that going, ooh, I could cross multiply and solve the proportion. Well, that would actually be okay, but I'm going to tell you if you do that, you're going to end up with some extraneous solutions. If you do it our way, in this particular problem, you don't end up with extraneous solutions, so we're trying to convince you to do it our way.
And
Have
what's
you
our way
noticed?
again?
Our way is to factor all the denominators,
And multiply.
find the least common denominator,
Okay.
multiply it all the way through, and get rid of all the fractions to begin with.
Got it.
Okay.
All right. First denominator, 2x minus 2. I see a 2.
I see a
So
2
2
to x minus 1. So we're going to, that denominator no longer exists. It's
Okay.
now written as 2 times x minus 1. X squared minus 1 is really the what?
Oh, difference of squares.
Yes! Got to get that installed in your head. This is going to factor to x plus 1 and x minus 1 every single time. No need to do anything else with it. So, what is our least common denominator then?
Well, we need a 2-piece.
We need a 2x minus 1,
Yes, we do.
and we need anything new for the second one. Well, x plus 1 is new,
Okay.
but
Well,
x
we don't
minus
need
1
x
is already there.
Okay.
So we're going to multiply this by 5 over 2 times x minus 1
Do you want to show
equals...
them how they write it on both sides?
Sure, we can do that. We'll just write it on that side. And then we're going to multiply 2 times x minus 1 times x plus 1 times 15 over x minus 1 times x plus 1.
So a minute ago we mentioned that you could write the least common denominator next to all the terms, or you could write it the way I did. So we
Notice
just
how
want
it
to show
takes
you
up
both
more
ways.
space this way, but here's the fun part about doing it this way.
fun
You
to
can then
cancel.
just start canceling. 2 cancels with 2, x minus 1 cancels with x minus 1, and this is why we have that 5 times x plus 1 equals x minus 1 cancels, x plus 1 cancels, and we're left with 2 times 15, which is just 30.
Okay.
Now we can just solve this.
So we
wanna-
could distribute, divide, whatever we want
We
to
could do
X
that.
plus 1 is 6.
We end up dividing by 5, we get x plus 1 is 6, subtract
is 5.
1, 5. And notice that we need to double check that this answer does not give me a 0 in any denominator. But remember, we factored on a denominator, so the only two numbers that would not have worked up here were x could not equal 1 or negative 1.
But 5 isn't either of those.
5 is okay, so
5
it
is
checks
good.
out.
All right.
Easy enough.
Next example.
Let's get going.
I think we got a couple more. This would be a great place for you to pause the video and try the next two problems on your own. Make sure you can get the LCD, and make sure you can get the correct answers. Okay? Are you back?
I'm back.
He's back.
I don't
All
know if I left or not.
So before we do
Factoring.
our LCD, we need to factor this.
Use the box,
Yep, if you
or
need
just
it.
stare at it and find two numbers that multiply to make 12 that add to make negative 7.
Which works pretty easily because it's 1x squared. So our LCD is going to be,
Well, we take the first fraction, which is x minus 3,
okay,
and we need an x minus 3. We also need an x minus 4, because that's from the second fraction. And the third fraction doesn't add anything new, which is
Doesn't.
nice. So we're going to multiply everything by x minus 3 and x minus 4.
I'm going to do it your way because
You like canceling, don't
I
you?
like canceling. So I can rewrite this and just kind of spread everything out a little bit. Notice I'm going to keep the factored version right here.
And again, I can't emphasize enough that if you're getting these wrong by any measure or any reason, especially if you're messing up a sign or you're leaving off something little, but you understand the process, then this is the best way to fix that issue, is to just write it all out, and then you won't be missing those little pieces
Yep.
anymore.
So notice we've used the least common denominator 3 times, and then we just start canceling. So we've got an x times an x minus 4,
Plus,
a 1 times an x minus 3,
And again, we highly suggest not multiplying it out on this step. Just go ahead and write it all down. Now that the fractions are gone, we're back to what we did a couple days ago when we did
P5,
quadratic
I
ones.
think.
So then we multiply everything out. Notice we're getting x squareds and x's.
Okay.
So usually that means we're going to get the urge to set this equation equal to 0, unless you want to use completing the square, but most people choose not to. Once we set it equal to 0, we can factor. We could use the quadratic formula. This actually factors rather easily, so we're going to go ahead and do that. If you don't see the factoring and you're
Use the
spending
box.
more than 30 seconds to factor, then you might want to just go ahead and use the quadratic formula. But
Or use a box.
get used to doing the factoring
Yep.
because it's a skill you really need to have.
And some people can do the box faster than other people could stare at it, so
Absolutely.
it doesn't matter to us.
So now we have x minus 4 times x plus 1 equals 0, so both factors could equal 0. So x could have to equal 4, or x could equal negative 1. Before we move on, let's go back to our original problem and double check. What x value made the first fraction have a 0 in the bottom?
X could not be a negative 3.
So 3
I'm
was
sorry,
off
a
limits.
3.
What about
Okay.
the second fraction?
X could not be a positive 4.
X should not be a 4. Did we get either one of these
Uh-oh,
answers?
we got a positive 4.
So what do we call that again?
We call that extraneous,
An
and we
extraneous.
leave it off of our answer, and we simply say x equals negative 1 is our answer.
That's right. We need
Okay.
to see somehow that you got 4 as an answer and you realize it didn't work.
Absolutely.
That's what we're looking for.
This is the easiest way
Crossing
to do
it off is good enough.
Okay?
Okay?
Alrighty, one more example. Again, you might want to pause this one and give it a try. Again, the least common denominator here is just a little bit tricky, but give it a pause, give it a try.
Okay. You want me to do this one?
Okay.
All right.
You want to write?
I want to write.
Okay.
You hold that.
Oh,
All right.
yes.
So let's take a look at this. We have x plus 3 as our first fraction, or denominator. So that's the factor.
Okay.
We have 4 minus x. Now, that's going to be a little different because the x is backwards. If it was 4 plus x, we could just rearrange it. We're going to hold on to that for just a moment.
Yep.
X squared minus x minus 12.
Ooh, we should
What
factor
urge
that.
do we get? We get
How about-
factoring urges.
X minus 4 and x plus 3.
And again, if you need help doing that, come talk to us. However, you should be pretty good at it by now.
Okay, well, I like the x plus 3,
The x plus 3's are the same here and here,
but that
but you notice
4
that
minus
this
x
x
is a little
minus
different.
4 is almost the same as 4 minus x, but it's not, is
it's
it?
not, because the x is negative,
And subtraction is not
commutative.
commutative. So,
Okay.
however, we can make them look like each other.
Okay.
In fact, if we wanted to rewrite this part of the problem right here with the x first, all we'd have to do is take out a negative 1 as a common factor.
Well, how about we write negative x plus 4?
Okay, we could write negative x plus 4, and we've rewritten it.
Okay.
Then we could factor out a negative 1.
Oh, because when the first coefficient's negative, we usually take a negative out.
Absolutely. And
Okay.
we end up with x minus
Minus
4.
four. I know
And
it is an
now
x minus
we have
4.
x minus 4 in both parts.
But we have an extra
We have an
negative
extra
1.
factor of negative 1, which we will have to include.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and just take up some more room here and rewrite this as it's 2 over x plus 3. Then we have a minus 3 over negative 1 times x minus 4.
Okay.
Just to clean this up. You don't need to factor the numerators if you haven't noticed. We don't even worry about those.
Nope. That'll come out.
And
It'll
so
wash.
now we have this new problem, and we're going to solve it.
Okay.
We're going to solve by multiplying the entire thing by the least common denominator.
All right.
So we take the x plus 3. We take the x minus 4 and the negative 1, and I'm going to put the negative 1 in front.
So we don't lose it that way.
I didn't really plan for that real well, but there's x minus 4
Okay.
and our negative 1. And then we take everything that's new. Well, x minus 4 is already there.
Yep.
X plus 3 is already there. So the
Nothing
last
new.
fraction contributes nothing.
Okay.
Now we're going to multiply that denominator times everything.
By all three pieces.
And hopefully by now this is making sense. If you want to write it all down, you can. I'm going to go ahead and not write this one. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
I've got x plus 3 is going to cancel with x plus 3. So I have a 2 times a negative 1 times an x minus 4. Is it okay if I multiply the 2 and the negative 1 to make negative 2
Perfect.
times x minus 4?
Yep. And again, we're recommending that you do not do any distributing during this step because you're that's too much in your brain. You're making
Lots
a
of
mistake.
negatives and
We
distributing.
don't even do that.
So the next one has a minus 3.
Times the negative 1. Oh, and the negative 1
The
cancels.
negative 1's going to cancel.
Okay.
The x minus 4 is going to cancel.
So times
So
an
I
x
have an
plus
x
3.
plus 3. Be careful that you have at negative 3 there. Equals. The last fraction is going to multiply. The x minus 4 and the x plus 3 are going to cancel. So we're only going to get this negative 1 multiplied by the 2x minus 2.
And again, whenever your numerator has more than one piece, you're going to need these parentheses right here.
Okay?
Okay? So you don't lose track of anything.
We now have no fractions.
Algebra 1.
Let's
distribute.
just beat this to death. This is negative 2x plus 8 minus 3x minus 9, negative 2x plus 2. Combine my like terms over here. We get negative 5x minus 1
Notice this time there's nothing squared, so we can get the x's on one side, the numbers on the other.
Add 5x to the other side, subtract 2, divide by 3, we get x equals
-1.
-1.
Very nice.
What do we got to check?
We gotta go make sure we didn't divide by 0.
All the way back to the beginning. Does -1 make any of these fractions 0 at the
No,
bottom?
It
Nope.
does not.
So we are okay
So that
and
big
good.
ugly mess just equals x is -1.
Yep.
Math is so cool. Hey, guess what?
I think we're done.
We're not only done with lesson 2.8, we're done with chapter P.
Which had 2 in it somewhere.
Yeah, it had this in it.
All right.
Okay, so that's it for the chapter, and you should be getting ready for a review and a test.
See you in class.